The research station floated in the darkness of space like a small metal flower orbiting a dying star. Inside the station, alien scientists moved through their daily work with calm efficiency. The Velcrin people had never known war in their long history. They were explorers and scholars who spent their lives studying the mysteries of the universe. This particular station had been placed at the edge of the Cascade sector, specifically to study the strange gravitational forces that twisted and pulled at the fabric of space itself. For 3 full cycles, the team of 12 scientists had worked in peaceful isolation, collecting data and running experiments that would take years to fully understand. Their leader was a seasoned researcher named Telvin, who had spent most of his life among the stars. He enjoyed the quiet solitude of deep space research, where the only sounds were the gentle hum of life support systems and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment. The station had basic shields and no weapons because the Velcrin had never needed such things. Violence was something they read about in historical texts from other species, not something they prepared for in their daily lives. Everything changed on the morning of the 4th cycle, when the sensors detected multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. Telvin looked at his display screen with confusion rather than fear, because unannounced visitors were unusual, but not necessarily dangerous. The confusion turned to terror within seconds as the first plasma bolt struck the station's outer hull. The impact sent vibrations through the entire structure and knocked 2 scientists off their feet. Alarms began screaming throughout the station as more weapons fire tore into the shields. Through the observation windows, Telvin could see the attacking ships clearly now. They were Kresh vessels, angular and aggressive in design, built for one purpose only. The Kresh were known throughout the galaxy as raiders and pirates who preyed on isolated outposts and defenseless colonies. They took what they wanted and killed anyone who resisted. The station's computer automatically activated the distress beacon and began broadcasting emergency signals on every frequency in its database. Telvin ran to the communications console while his colleagues frantically tried to strengthen the failing shields. His hands shook as he cycled through protocol after protocol, sending out calls for help in dozens of different formats. The Galactic Standard Distress Call went out first, then the Regional Emergency Channel, then specific frequencies for nearby military patrols. Nothing came back except empty static. The nearest Galactic Council station was weeks away even at maximum speed. No commercial vessels traveled through this remote sector. They were alone with the Kresh bearing down on them like predators who had cornered wounded prey. The hull breached in 3 places within the first hour. Telvin ordered everyone to fall back to the central laboratory, which had reinforced walls and its own independent life support. They sealed the doors and tried to barricade themselves inside, but everyone knew it was only buying time. The Kresh wanted the station as a base for future raids into more populated systems. The research and the scientists meant nothing to them. Through the internal cameras, Telvin watched as armored Kresh warriors forced their way into the outer sections. They moved with brutal efficiency, checking every room and corridor. 2 scientists who had been trapped in the sleeping quarters were killed immediately. When they tried to surrender, hours passed in terrified silence, broken only by the sounds of the Kresh methodically working their way deeper into the station. Telvin kept sending distress signals even though hope was fading with each passing minute. He cycled through every emergency protocol in the database, including several marked with warnings like deprecated or restricted access or obsolete. One particular frequency caught his attention because it was tagged with a species name he barely recognized: human. The database entry was over 200 years old and contained very little information. It simply stated that this frequency had once been monitored by a species called humanity, who had withdrawn from galactic affairs long ago. Most civilizations assumed humans were either extinct or had chosen complete isolation from the rest of the galaxy. Telvin activated the old human distress protocol anyway, because what did he have to lose? He sent out the signal and waited. Nothing happened for several minutes. The Kresh were now directly outside the laboratory doors, setting up cutting equipment to breach the final barrier. Telvin could hear the high-pitched whine of plasma torches beginning to cut through the reinforced metal. He looked at his fellow survivors, seeing his own fear reflected in their faces. They had maybe 10 minutes left before the Kresh broke through. Some of his colleagues were praying to their various deities while others simply held each other in farewell embraces. Then the communications console made a sound that Telvin had never heard before. It was a response signal. Someone had answered. He rushed to the console and activated the translator. The message was brief, and the computer struggled to convert the ancient human language patterns into something understandable. The words that appeared on his screen were simple but powerful. Signal received. Cavalry inbound. Hold position. Telvin did not know what the word cavalry meant, but something in the tone of that message sent a chill down his spine. It was not the gentle reassurance of a rescue ship offering assistance. It was something else entirely. Something that carried the weight of absolute certainty. In the background of the transmission, Telvin heard sounds that the computer could not properly translate. It registered them simply as multiple engine signatures, but that description felt inadequate. It sounded like thunder rolling across mountains. It sounded like hundreds of massive engines all roaring to life at exactly the same moment. It sounded like something vast and powerful and utterly unstoppable beginning to move. The message had included a timestamp. 40 minutes until arrival. Telvin shared this information with his colleagues, who greeted it with desperate hope, mixed with confusion. None of them knew anything about humans beyond vague historical references. They had no idea what was coming or whether it would arrive in time. The crash broke through the laboratory door 37 minutes later. 3 armored warriors pushed into the room with weapons raised. The lead Kresh warrior looked at the cowering scientists with what might have been amusement. He raised his weapon and prepared to fire. Then every light in the station suddenly flickered and went red. Warning klaxons began blaring. The Kresh warrior paused and touched his helmet, clearly receiving communication from his ship. His body language changed instantly from confident to concerned. He barked orders to his companions, and they rushed back out of the laboratory without another glance at their captives. Telvin pulled himself to the communications console and accessed the external sensors. What he saw on the display made his breath catch in his throat. Ships. Hundreds of ships. They had appeared from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, surrounding the station like protective guardians. They were human vessels, and they had arrived exactly on time. The cavalry had come, and the Kresh were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Admiral Helen Krauss stood on the bridge of her flagship with her hands clasped behind her back, in the military posture she had maintained for 30 years of service. The UNS Defiant was the pride of the Third Fleet, a massive warship that carried enough firepower to level a small moon. Behind her vessel, 217 more ships hung in the darkness of space, all waiting for her command. They had traveled for nearly 40 minutes at maximum faster-than-light speed to reach this remote sector, after receiving the ancient distress call. Helen had been in her quarters reviewing supply reports when the communications officer burst in with news that one of the old emergency protocols had activated. She had ordered the entire fleet to battle stations immediately, because those protocols had not been used in 2 centuries, and their activation meant someone was in desperate trouble. Lieutenant Kyle Morrison sat at the tactical station with his eyes fixed on the sensor displays. He was young for his position, but had earned his place through exceptional skill during the academy simulations. His voice was steady as he reported what the sensors were showing. The research station was badly damaged with hull breaches in multiple sections, and its shields were failing rapidly. 14 Kresh raider ships were circling it like sharks around wounded prey, taking turns firing on the weakened defenses. Kyle could see the life sign indicators showing that people were still alive inside the station, but those readings were fading. They had maybe minutes left before the Kresh finished them off. Helen studied the tactical display with the cold calculation of someone who had fought in more battles than she cared to remember. The Kresh were notorious throughout the galaxy as pirates and slavers who preyed on anyone too weak to defend themselves. They typically ran away when confronted by superior force, but they were vicious and cruel when they held the advantage. She had read intelligence reports about Kresh raids and what they did to their victims. The reports had made her angry enough to put her fist through a wall. Now she had 14 Kresh ships right in front of her, and every weapon in the fleet was ready to deliver. Justice Commander Vincent Price worked at the communications console coordinating the fleet movements. He was Helen's second in command and had served with her for 15 years. They understood each other so well that sometimes orders were unnecessary. Vincent sent out the tactical commands, and every ship in the fleet acknowledged instantly. They moved into attack formation Theta 7, which was designed specifically for situations where the enemy needed to be surrounded and neutralized quickly. The human ships spread out in a 3-dimensional sphere around the target area, with overlapping fields of fire. No matter which direction the Kresh tried to run, they would fly straight into human weapons. Captain Danny Green commanded the Defiant from the helm station. He had been flying warships since before some of his crew were born, and he knew every capability of the massive vessel. When Helen gave the order to advance at full military power, Danny's hands moved across his controls with practiced precision. The Defiant surged forward and the entire fleet followed in perfect synchronization. They accelerated hard enough that the inertial dampeners strained to keep the crew comfortable. Within seconds, they were moving at combat speed toward the embattled station. The Kresh never saw them coming. One moment, the raiders were methodically tearing apart the defenseless research station, and the next moment, they were surrounded by enough firepower to crack a planet. Helen watched the tactical display as targeting solutions locked onto every Kresh vessel simultaneously. The enemy ships were still trying to figure out what was happening when the human fleet opened fire. Railguns launched solid projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. Missiles streaked from launch tubes with guidance systems that could track a fighter through an asteroid field. Energy weapons painted the darkness with beams of concentrated destruction. 3 Kresh ships simply ceased to exist in the first volley. They vanished in expanding spheres of superheated plasma and debris. 4 more raiders realized the danger and tried to flee, but human destroyers had already moved to block every escape route. The Kresh found themselves in a killing box with nowhere to run and no chance of survival. Helen opened a communications channel to the enemy vessels, and her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. She identified herself as Admiral Helen Krauss of the United Nations Third Fleet and gave the Kresh one chance to surrender. She told them to power down their weapons and prepare to be boarded. She made it clear this was their only warning. The response from the Kresh commander was a burst of plasma fire aimed directly at the Defiant's forward section. The shot struck the shield arrays and dissipated harmlessly, unable to penetrate the advanced defensive systems. Vincent looked up from his console with a slight smile and quietly observed that the Kresh had made a serious mistake. Helen agreed and gave the order that sealed the raiders' fate. All ships were authorized for free fire. The human fleet was unleashed. The battle lasted exactly 6 minutes from start to finish. When the weapons finally stopped firing, 11 Kresh ships were nothing but expanding clouds of debris. 3 raiders had thrown down their weapons and broadcast surrender signals fast enough to save themselves. Human boarding parties moved in to secure the surrendered vessels and take the crews into custody. The Velkrin research station hung in space like a battered survivor stumbling away from a terrible accident. Its hull was scarred and breached in multiple places, but it was intact, and the life signs inside were stable. Helen opened a channel to the station and identified herself again. She told the survivors that the Third Fleet had received their distress call and responded. She asked if anyone was still alive inside. The response came in broken Galactic Standard, the universal language that most spacefaring species used for communication. The translator had difficulty with the speaker's accent and emotional state, but the message was clear. There were 23 survivors, and they were confused about who had rescued them. The speaker asked if they were really talking to humans because the database said humanity was inactive and had withdrawn from galactic affairs. Helen allowed herself a small smile at that question. She replied that reports of human inactivity had been greatly exaggerated. She told the Velkrin survivors to stand by and that rescue teams were already on their way. Human support craft launched from the fleet carriers and headed toward the damaged station. They carried medical personnel, engineers, and supplies to help the survivors. Vincent worked his console to establish contact with Earth Command and inform them of the situation. Helen knew that the High Command would want a full explanation for why an entire fleet had suddenly appeared in a sector where humans were not supposed to be operating. Vincent confirmed that he was already preparing the report, but he pointed out that Command would probably be more interested in what was about to happen next. Helen asked what he meant, and Vincent gestured toward the long-range sensors. The displays were showing new contacts appearing at the edge of sensor range. More Kresh signatures, many more. Kyle checked the tactical computer and reported the numbers with growing concern. The main Kresh fleet had detected the human presence, and they were changing course. More than 700 warships were now heading directly toward the Third Fleet's position. Helen's smile grew colder and more dangerous. She told Vincent that this development was actually convenient because it would save them the trouble of hunting the Kresh down. She ordered a message sent to the Velkrin survivors warning them to move to the most protected area of their station. Things were about to get extremely loud and she wanted the civilians as safe as possible. The crew of the Defiant moved with calm efficiency to prepare for the coming battle. They had trained for situations exactly like this, and every person on the bridge knew their role perfectly. Helen looked out at the stars and felt a grim satisfaction. The Kresh were coming to her instead of making her chase them across the sector. Sometimes the enemy made things easy. Warlord Krathik stood in the command center of his flagship and watched the tactical hologram with rage burning in his chest. 14 ships had been destroyed in mere minutes and 3 more had surrendered like cowards. The species responsible was not even listed in the current threat assessment database that the Kresh military maintained. His intelligence officer had spent the last hour searching through historical archives, trying to find any information about these mysterious attackers. Finally, the officer found a reference buried in records that were over 200 years old. The species was called human, and according to the ancient files, they had once made contact with the Galactic Council before withdrawing completely to their own territory. The records indicated no military conflicts and no aggressive actions. The classification listed them as a peaceful scientific species, interested primarily in exploration and research. Krathix read the file twice and grew more angry with each word. Someone had clearly made a terrible mistake in that classification, because peaceful species did not possess fleets of warships that could destroy Kresh raiders in 6 minutes. His second-in-command stood nearby and carefully suggested that perhaps the historical information was not accurate. Krathix threw the datapad across the room in frustration. The human fleet consisted of just over 200 ships, which was impressive for a rescue force, but his armada numbered more than 700 vessels. The Kresh Dominion had been raiding this sector for 5 years without encountering any serious resistance. The Galactic Council was too slow and too concerned with proper procedures to respond effectively to emergency situations. These humans would learn the same lesson that every other species in this region had learned. The Kresh took what they wanted and destroyed anyone who interfered. Krathix gave orders for the entire fleet to converge on the human position. He wanted those ships either captured or destroyed, and he wanted the humans to understand what happened when someone challenged the Dominion. If humanity possessed this level of technology, then their homeworlds would be valuable prizes worth claiming. The Kresh fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel and headed toward the coordinates where the humans waited. Krathix allowed himself a moment of anticipation because these humans might actually provide more interesting combat than the usual defenseless prey his forces encountered. The Kresh Armada dropped back into normal space in attack. Formation and Krathix's anticipation died instantly. The humans had not fled or retreated to safer territory. They had spread out in a defensive sphere around the damaged research station, and their numbers had increased slightly with perhaps 50 additional vessels joining the original force. The human ships hung in space with a kind of patient confidence that made Krathix's combat instincts scream warnings. He had survived dozens of battles by learning to recognize when prey was actually a predator in disguise. Every tactical sense he possessed told him to withdraw immediately, but his pride would not allow such cowardice. He ordered all ships into attack formation and commanded them to show the humans what happened when someone interfered with the Kresh Dominion. The 2 fleets closed the distance rapidly. The Kresh opened fire first, launching thousands of plasma bolts and kinetic projectiles across the void. The barrage was massive enough to overwhelm most defensive systems through sheer volume of fire. The human shields flickered and flashed as they absorbed the incoming weapons, but they held firm without breaking. Then the humans returned fire, and Krathix realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The human weapons were different from anything he had encountered before. Their railguns fired solid projectiles at velocities that punched through Kresh shields like they were made of paper. Their missiles maneuvered with impossible agility, and their guidance systems seemed to predict evasive maneuvers before his ships even made them. Energy weapons struck with surgical precision, targeting critical systems with accuracy that should not have been possible at these ranges. Krathix had fought in over 100 battles during his career. He understood the sounds and rhythms of combat. He knew what ship destruction looked like and how fleets died, but he had never experienced anything remotely like this engagement. The humans fought with brutal efficiency that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. Their formations shifted fluidly to respond to Kresh tactics. When his ships tried to concentrate fire on single targets, the humans moved to provide overlapping defensive coverage. When Kresh vessels attempted boarding actions, They found themselves isolated and cut apart by coordinated strikes from multiple angles. Every human ship seemed to know exactly what every other human ship was doing. They fought like a single organism with hundreds of deadly limbs. 20 minutes into the battle, Krathix had lost 100 ships. The humans had lost exactly 3 vessels. His tactical officer reported that the human losses appeared to be the result of unfortunate positioning, rather than superior crash tactics. The numbers were impossible and terrifying. Krathix's second-in-command urgently suggested that they should withdraw immediately and reassess the situation. Krathix refused to accept defeat. He ordered the dreadnoughts forward and commanded them to activate their siege weapons. 5 massive Kresh battleships pushed through the fleet formation toward the front line. These were the vessels that had broken planetary defenses and reduced fortified positions to rubble. Their spinal-mounted plasma cannons began charging with enough power to vaporize smaller ships completely. The human admiral seemed to have been waiting for exactly this move. The human fleet formation parted smoothly like a curtain being drawn aside. Through the opening came 6 vessels that made Krathix's blood run cold with primal fear, human dreadnoughts. Each one was larger than his own flagship and covered with weapon emplacements that glowed with barely contained energy. They opened fire simultaneously and the Kresh siege ships died. All 5 of them were destroyed in less than 10 seconds, vaporized by concentrated nuclear fire that turned them into miniature suns before they could even return fire. Krathix finally accepted what his instincts had been screaming since the battle began. He gave the order to retreat. All ships were to jump to faster than light immediately and return to Dominion space. The fleet began the emergency withdrawal procedure, but the humans were not finished. Their fastest ships pursued the fleeing Kresh vessels like hunters chasing wounded animals. They harried the retreat and destroyed stragglers who could not jump quickly enough. By the time Krathix's damaged flagship escaped to safety, he had lost over 300 ships. The humans had lost 8 vessels total. Krathix sat in his command chair as the fleet limped toward home territory. He pulled up the ancient file on humanity again and read through it more carefully. At the bottom of the document was a note that had been added by some analyst long dead. The note classified humans as peaceful, but included an important warning. No data existed on human military capabilities because the species had withdrawn from galactic contact following some kind of territorial dispute. The analyst recommended avoiding any provocation of humanity until more information could be gathered. Krathix understood now with perfect clarity. The humans had not been peaceful in the way the Kresh understood that word. They had simply been patient. They had spent 2 centuries in isolation building and preparing and waiting. He had just reminded the entire galaxy why some species chose to remain undisturbed. The Kresh had kicked a sleeping giant and that giant had stood up angry and ready for war. Krathix knew that his superiors would demand explanations for the devastating losses. He also knew that the Kresh Dominion's days of easy raiding were finished. The humans were back and they had brought enough firepower to reshape the balance of power across known space. The Galactic Council chamber on Centralis Prime was a massive structure that had stood for 10,000 years as a symbol of diplomatic cooperation among the stars. The chamber could hold representatives from 500 different species, and today nearly every seat was filled. The air buzzed with nervous energy and excited conversation that bordered on chaos. Ambassador Lyris of the Velthri Commonwealth stood at her podium, with all 4 of her eyes wide with disbelief as she read through the official report for the 3rd time. She raised her voice to be heard over the noise and asked the assembly to confirm that she understood the situation correctly. A human fleet consisting of over 200 vessels had appeared in the Cascade sector without authorization, destroyed a Kresh raiding force, and then engaged and defeated a Kresh armada of 700 ships. Admiral Helen Krauss stood in the witness circle at the center of the chamber wearing her dress uniform. She had spent the last 6 days coordinating rescue operations and managing fleet deployments across the sector. She looked tired, but her posture remained military straight, and her voice was calm and clear. She confirmed that Ambassador Lyris had summarized the events accurately. The 3rd Fleet had responded to a distress call that was broadcast on one of the old human emergency frequencies. She said it simply as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Council Chair Nexum spoke with his crystalline voice that carried a note of accusation. He pointed out that the frequency in question had not been active for 200 years, and that humanity was supposed to have deactivated all emergency channels when they chose isolation from galactic society. Helen responded with patience that clearly required effort to maintain. She explained that humanity had not deactivated anything. They had simply stopped advertising their presence to the galaxy. All emergency channels had remained under constant monitoring. Someone had needed help and the humans had answered. She said that was what civilized species were supposed to do when they heard calls for assistance. A murmur of conversation ran through the assembled ambassadors. Telvin the Velcrin scientist stood from his observer seat and asked permission to speak. When Council Chair Nexum granted permission, Telvin stated clearly that the humans had saved the lives of everyone on his research station. His people were grateful beyond any measure or words. Nexum acknowledged this, but his tone softened only slightly. He said that no one was questioning the valor of the rescue operation, but there were serious concerns about protocol. The humans had brought a military fleet into Council-controlled space without proper authorization. They had engaged in major combat operations without consulting the Council. Reports now indicated that the human fleet had no intention of leaving the sector. Helen allowed herself a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. She corrected the Council Chair and said that his information was not entirely accurate. The Third Fleet was indeed leaving the Cascade sector. They were expanding their patrol routes to include it along with several neighboring regions. The chamber erupted in arguments and shouted objections. Helen waited patiently with her hands clasped behind her back in the same posture her crew had seen 1,000 times. It was the stance of someone who had made a decision and would not be moved by any amount of debate or protest. Council Chair Nexum raised one crystalline hand and called for silence. When the chamber finally quieted, he asked Helen to explain herself immediately. Helen said she would be happy to provide an explanation. She began by stating that humanity had remained in their own territory for 200 years. They had watched the galactic community from a distance with careful attention. They had observed the Kresh raids and the Talvorn incursions and the pirate cartels that preyed on isolated colonies. They had watched the Council issue statements and sanctions and strongly worded diplomatic letters. They had also watched species die while waiting for help that arrived weeks too late or never came at all. Ambassador Lyris protested that the Council had limited military resources. She said they could not be everywhere at once and that response times were constrained by the realities of space travel and bureaucratic process. Helen nodded and replied with two simple words that carried enormous weight. She said that humanity could. The chamber fell completely silent. Helen continued speaking in a steady voice that carried to every corner of the vast room. She said that humanity possessed 17 full fleets, and that each one was comparable in strength to the force she had brought to the Cascade sector. For 200 years, humans had been building and preparing and hoping they would never need to use what they had created. But when that distress call came through, humanity remembered why they had built these fleets in the first place, not for conquest or glory or territorial expansion, for moments exactly like the one at the Velcrin station when someone somewhere needed help immediately and could not wait 3 weeks for proper authorization forms to be filed and processed. The silence in the chamber was profound. Helen continued with growing intensity in her voice. She explained exactly what was going to happen next. The Third Fleet would remain in the Cascade sector and surrounding regions. They would expand patrols into areas that had experienced increased raider activity. They would offer protection to any station, colony, or vessel that requested assistance. They would respond to distress calls regardless of whether those calls were specifically intended for human forces. Council Chair Nexum stated flatly that the Council could not authorize such actions. Helen replied that humanity was not asking for authorization. They were informing the Council as a courtesy. Humanity was resuming an active role in galactic affairs. The Council could choose to work with human forces or they could file formal complaints. But while the Council debated and discussed, human ships would be out in space making sure that what happened to the Velcrin station never happened to anyone else. Helen reached into her uniform pocket and removed a small data storage chip. She placed it on the platform in the center of the witness circle. She explained that the chip contained updated information about human military capabilities, fleet deployments, and communication protocols. She suggested strongly that the Council review the information carefully. They would find detailed documentation of humanity's new policy regarding piracy, slavery, and unprovoked aggression. She said that humans were happy to coordinate operations with Council forces, but she wanted to make one thing absolutely clear. Humanity was no longer sitting on the sidelines watching others suffer. As Helen turned to leave the chamber, Telvin spoke again. He addressed her directly and thanked her on behalf of his entire species. He said that humans could have ignored the distress signal. They could have let the Velcrin die alone in the darkness, but they had not done that. Helen paused and looked back at the Velcrin scientist. She said that someone had once told her that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their military tactics. It was their complete inability to hear a cry for help and do nothing about it. She called it an old habit that humans had never been able to break. Helen walked out of the council chamber to stunned silence. Outside the building, Commander Vincent Price waited with a transport shuttle ready to return them to the fleet. Vincent asked how the meeting had gone. Helen replied that it had gone about as expected. The council members were terrified and grateful and angry all at the same time. She predicted they would eventually accept the new situation. Vincent asked what would happen if the council refused to accept it. Helen boarded the shuttle and settled into her seat with visible satisfaction. She said that if the council did not accept it, then they would simply get used to it. She ordered Vincent to plot a course back to the Defiant. There were patrols to organize and distress frequencies to monitor, and a galaxy that needed protection. Vincent acknowledged the orders and said it was good to have humanity back in the galaxy. Helen looked out the viewport at the countless stars beyond and agreed. It was very good to be back. 3 months had passed since humanity returned to active galactic affairs, and the effects rippled across known space like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Captain Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the UNS Vigilant, a Frontier-class destroyer assigned to patrol duties in the outer fringe territories. Her ship was one of 40 spread across a region that had suffered more than 50 pirate attacks in the previous year. In the 12 weeks since human patrols began, there had been only 2 attempted raids. Both attempts had ended very badly for the raiders who made them. Lieutenant Paul Anderson called out from the communication station that they were receiving a distress signal. A convoy of civilian freighters was under attack at bearing 273 and distance 40 million kilometers. Lisa immediately ordered battle stations and told the helm to engage maximum speed. The tactical officer began calculating target solutions before they even completed the jump to faster-than-light travel. The Vigilant leapt forward through space and covered the distance in less than 4 minutes. They dropped back into normal space to find 3 pirate corvettes harassing a group of unarmed cargo transports. The pirates spotted the human destroyer immediately and broke off their attack. The 3 raider ships scattered in different directions trying to escape. Lisa ordered pursuit of the lead corvette and told her crew to send a clear message about what happened to pirates in human-patrolled space. The Vigilant caught the fleeing ship within minutes and disabled its engines with a single precision strike from their railgun. Human boarding parties secured the vessel and took its crew into custody for transfer to council authorities. The other 2 pirates escaped, but Lisa knew they would spread the word quickly. Anyone who attacked a convoy in human-protected territory could expect a destroyer on top of them before they finished stealing their first cargo container. The Vigilant escorted the grateful convoy to the nearest station where the civilian captains thanked the human crew repeatedly. While docked, Lisa received an encrypted priority message from Admiral Helen Krauss. She read it carefully and then read it again with a smile spreading across her face. She called Lieutenant Paul Anderson over and told him to send a fleet-wide bulletin. The Galactic Council had formally recognized humanity's security operations throughout the outer territories. They were now requesting that human patrols expand into the Tarvos sector as well. The military operations that had been called unauthorized just 3 months ago were now officially designated as essential peacekeeping activities. Paul observed quietly that the council had certainly changed their tune quickly. Lisa agreed and asked him for the current statistics. Paul reported that human forces had lost 19 ships across all fleets in the past 3 months. Most of those losses were due to accidents and mechanical failures rather than actual combat. Lisa asked about civilian casualties in their patrol zones. Paul checked his data and reported 73 deaths compared to over 4,000 in the same time period from the previous year. Lisa nodded with satisfaction and said the numbers spoke for themselves. The council understood this, and so did the civilian populations. Even the raiders and pirates understood. There was a new standard in the galaxy now, and that standard was enforced by human warships. Similar scenes played out across dozens of sectors. Young officers like Lieutenant Commander Jake Phillips commanded a frigate in the Deneb cluster, while Captain Nicole Ward led a carrier group in the Serpent's Void. Their names became known on worlds they had never visited. Children on frontier colonies told stories about the human ships that came when people needed help. The Kresh Dominion, bloodied and humiliated by their defeat, withdrew completely to their core territories and stopped all raiding operations. The Talvorn Concordat observed what happened to the Kresh and suddenly became very interested in resolving their border disputes through diplomatic channels. Pirate cartels simply vanished from entire sectors as their members decided that retirement was preferable to encountering human patrol vessels. But humanity did not become complacent with these victories. In the massive shipyards that orbited Earth and Mars and Titan, new vessels continued rolling off production lines at an increased pace. The defense budget expanded to meet growing commitments. Training programs added new recruits by the thousands. All of this was not preparation for conquest or war, but rather a commitment to a simple promise. Never again would a distress call go unanswered by those who had the power to help. Admiral Helen Krauss sat in her private quarters aboard the Defiant reviewing reports from across human-controlled space. Her terminal chimed with an incoming transmission and she accepted it. The holographic image of Telvin the Velkrin scientist appeared above her desk. He smiled as he informed her that the research station had been completely repaired and was fully operational again. He was pleased to report that 3 other species had asked to join their research program. They said they felt safe working in the Cascade sector now because of the human presence, because of what humanity had done. Helen returned the smile and told Telvin that was wonderful news. She encouraged him to keep up the excellent work. Before ending the call, she thanked him for sending that distress signal even though he had not meant to reach humanity specifically. Telvin replied that activating the old human protocol was the best mistake he had ever made. The transmission ended and Helen leaned back in her chair. She looked out the viewport at the stars beyond and thought about all the people out there who might need help at any moment. Someone somewhere could be in terrible trouble right now, but unlike 200 years ago, humanity would be there to answer their call. Commander Vincent Price entered her quarters carrying a datapad with new orders and requests. The Ninth Fleet was asking for deployment instructions because the Rigel Confederacy wanted human ships stationed in their system permanently. They were offering basing rights and full resupply support in exchange for protection. Helen approved the deployment without hesitation and asked what else needed her attention. Vincent reported that the Galactic Council wanted her to attend a major security summit next month. They were discussing the formation of a formal military alliance with humanity as the core member. Helen raised an eyebrow in surprise. She pointed out that just 3 months earlier, the Council had been threatening sanctions and demanding that human forces leave Council space. Now they wanted to build an alliance around human military power. Vincent agreed that it was quite a reversal. Helen told him to confirm her attendance at the summit, but to make sure the Council understood that human terms had not changed. Humanity would protect those who could not protect themselves. They would respond to distress calls no matter who sent them. They would not wait for permission to do what was right. Vincent said he would make sure the Council understood perfectly. As he left, Helen pulled up a star chart showing current human fleet positions across the galaxy. Red icons marked patrol routes, while blue ones indicated permanent station assignments and green ones showed rapid response groups. Together they formed a protective web spanning thousands of light years. 200 years ago, humanity had looked at the galaxy and made the difficult decision to step back. They had been called isolationist and fearful and even cowardly by some species. But humanity had never been any of those things. They had simply been preparing and building, and training to become the force that could answer when others called for help. When that old distress protocol activated and a desperate scientist sent a signal into the void hoping anyone would hear it, humanity proved what they had always known about themselves. They were the ones who came when called. They were the shield that stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The galaxy had forgotten about humanity, but humanity had never forgotten about the galaxy. Now they were back, not as conquerors or merchants, but as protectors. They did not mean to call humans, but a human armada answered, and that simple fact changed everything.